Behold, chapter 12. Check my pen. So, the previous chapter, chapter 11, was characterizing and classifying prokaryotes. And we only had one video for that, but characterizing and classifying eukaryotes will have two videos. The first video will be characterizing and classifying protozoa and helminths, and then classifying, characterizing eukaryotes 2 will be about fungus or fungi. So probably remember learning this in grade school, how to classify the different forms of life on Earth. And most people in the olden days, they started with kingdom. So you go kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And of course, humans, we're in the kingdom, the animal kingdom. And then our genus and species is Homo sapiens. You can use this method to classify protozoa and helminths, which are both eukaryotes. But we're not going to get into the details of this way of classifying. This is and then the second picture here, this is the tree of life. So you go down here, you start here at the origin of life, which is probably an RNA-based origin, and then it just branches to all the beautiful and colorful different types of living things on Earth. And here we are. So Australopithecus afarensis to modern Homo sapien. There's a lot of different ways to classify organisms. This is just something I found on the internet that shows a way of classifying things. So here's Animalia, that's where we are. Here's fungi, plantae or plantae, that's plants. Here's bacteria. And then you can just follow the diagrams and look at the different types. But this isn't really a classification course, so we're not going to get into details. But originally, our hero, Carolus Linnaeus, classified algae and fungi as plants, and then protozoa as animals. Later, I guess fungi got their own kingdom. Woohoo, they got their own kingdom. And then protozoa and algae were in the kingdom Protista. Today, we're using characteristics that are at the molecular level to classify these organisms, these eukaryotic organisms. So you look at the sequences of ribosomal RNA and see how similar they are, and then you can classify them. So eukaryotes are a huge assemblage of organisms. They're very diverse. In the microbial world, the eukaryotes in the microbial world include protozoa. So proto means pre, zoa is animals, so it's kind of like pre-animals. Algae are eukaryotes, fungi are eukaryotes, water molds, slime molds. So water molds and slime molds are fungi-like. They're all eukaryotes. And then the parasitic helminths, those are worms, those are eukaryotes. Arthropod vectors are eukaryotes. So vectors are just something that carries a disease. So for example, as you know, mosquitoes. This cartoon or a photograph of a mosquito. It's a vector, it carries a disease, so it's called, and it's an arthropod, so it's called an arthropod vector, but it's a eukaryote. Among the most frequent microbial causes of death via the mosquito as transporting the protozoa would be malaria. Everyone's heard of that. And the mosquito carries the protozoa called Plasmodium falciparum that causes that disease. And then you've probably heard of African sleeping sickness. The protozoa that causes that is called Trypanosoma cruzi. And then amoebic dysentery can be caused by a parasite. General characteristics of eukaryotic cells. They can reproduce sexually and asexually. This is a cartoon, reproduction sexually. So you probably have heard of mitosis and meiosis. Hopefully you learned it in your previous classes. But let's take, for example, our bodies. There are some cells in our bodies that do mitosis and some cells that do meiosis. The cells that do mitosis would include your skin cells. So your skin is constantly sloughing off and you have stem cells that will undergo mitosis to make new cells for your skin. Meiosis, however, is different. It occurs in the gonads, so it occurs in the ovaries and the testes, and you have one parent cell. From that you can make 4 daughter cells, and then these would be a sperm or egg, and then with sexual reproduction the sperm would meet the egg, form a zygote, and then you would be a little embryo and you would start doing mitosis to grow your little embryonic body. So it says here many eukaryotes reproduce sexually. I just talked about that. You need to do meiosis if you're going to reproduce sexually. You form gametes, so the gametes would be the sperm and the egg. Algae, fungi, some protozoa can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So remember in the previous video, asexual reproduction, there were many types, but the major type of asexual reproduction is by fission. Okay, so asexual reproduction in eukaryotes is by binary fission, but it can also be budding, fragmentation, spore formation, and this schizogony, which I'll show you that process on the next slide. So in schizogony, you have a single cell. Here's the nucleus, this purple thing. You'll undergo multiple mitoses within a single cell, but the cells won't split into daughter cells. And you'll form this thing called a schizont, and then the schizont will undergo cytokinesis. So that just means movement of the cytoplasm. And you form these things called merozoites. Plasmodium falciparum, that's the malaria protozoa, obviously that causes malaria, does this schizogony. When these merozoites are released into the blood, then the illness called malaria follows. So let's look at this cartoon, the kingdom Protista. So here we just talked about this. The malaria-causing Plasmodium falciparum usually is found inside the red blood cells of people affected with malaria. Here's a cartoon of Trypanosoma gambiense that causes African sleeping sickness. It's a protozoa. Trichonympha lives in the gut of termites, and this is the thing that digests wood when you have termites. And then there's some other creatures here in the kingdom called Protista. So within the kingdom that's called Protista, you have members, and those members in the kingdom can be protozoans, slime molds. That's not the same as a regular mold that you see on your bread or your jam, and then single-celled algae. These are all members of the kingdom called Protista. And in this cartoon, it just shows a protozoal life cycle. So here we've got the trophozoite, that's in the active feeding stage of this protozoa. If the environment becomes harsh, like there's lack of nutrients or it gets really dry, it can form this cyst, and then it can remain dormant until the nutrients come back or the water comes back, and then the cyst wall breaks open and you reactivate the trophozoite. That's a typical protozoan life cycle. Here's a typical life cycle of a plasmodial slime mold, and you don't have to know any of the details of this for your tests, except where I note it. But you can see there's all these different interesting steps of the way a plasmodial slime mold has a life cycle. So there's some meiosis involved. There's mature spores. There's flagellated gametes. Humans have flagellated gametes. They're called sperm. Processes syngamy, a zygote. So plasmodial slime molds have zygotes. We have zygotes. When the sperm meets the egg, we become a zygote. And then so that was a slime mold. Here's a life cycle of a single-celled algae. So algae do meiosis. Well, that's sexual reproduction. They have zygotes, diploid zygotes. Which we have. Haploid gametes. Algae have haploid gametes. We have those, the sperm and the egg. And so there are pieces of protozoa and algae and slime molds. Their life cycles they have parts of their life cycles that are similar to parts of our life cycles as humans. Eukaryotic Protista, that's a kingdom, and then the member of Protista is called a protozoa. It's a eukaryote. It's single cell, and most protozoa don't have a cell wall. Where would you find protozoa if you'd like to find some protozoa? Well, just go to your local pond or a lake or a stream. You can find protozoa there. In fact, when we're in class and we're not online, at East Campus, Deborah will go to the local pond and get some protozoa. We look at it in a microscope. Protozoa, though, are members of plankton. So maybe you've heard of plankton. It's part of the aquatic food chain. Protozoa are there. Plankton can also include the eukaryotes, fungi and algae. You can find protozoa where the soil is moist. You can find it in beach sand. If you go out and find some decaying organic matter, you could find protozoa. A few protozoa are pathogens. So, for example, we've talked about this malaria. The protozoa Plasmodium falciparum is pathogenic. Trypanosoma cruzi, that's a protozoa, that's pathogenic, causes African sleeping sickness. Most protozoa can move, that means they're motile, and they use cilia, flagella, or a false foot, a pseudopodia. So let's look at this cartoon. Here's protozoan morphology or its shape. So inside, it's got a macronucleus. That's where its DNA is. It's got a gullet where the food goes in. It also has a micronucleus. It's got cilia. We actually have cilia on the cells of our respiratory tract. Has an anus or an anal pore in this case, food vacuole, contractile vacuole to regulate its water content. And this specific protozoa in this cartoon is a paramecium. Okay. In your book, if you've got the Bauman text, this is table 12.2. It gives the category of protozoa and then the features within that category and then representative genre mentioned in the text. So we're not going to go into the details of the categories. Just a few things that you should note. Protozoa are non-photosynthetic and they're unicellular. And we said this earlier, protozoa can reproduce sexually or asexually. We showed some example of protozoans, but another example of protozoan that's pathogenic is Trichomonas vaginalis. So that lives in the vagina. Protozoa don't have a cell wall. So remember, bacteria have that cell wall with peptidoglycan in it. Protozoa do have a plasma membrane. It's a phospholipid bilayer. We've said this several times. Protozoa are unicellular and eukaryotic. And we've said that they are motile. They can move. So this is a chart of diseases. We've talked about the disease is called malaria. The agent that causes malaria is Plasmodium falciparum. the geographical location, over 100 countries in the tropic contain this protozoa. And here's the clinical features when you have that disease. Oh, here's trichomoniasis caused by Trichomonas vaginalis, and that's worldwide. You can find that disease worldwide. And here's the clinical symptoms. But so the three common or most common protozoal diseases or diseases caused by protozoan in the United States are giardiasis, trichomoniasis, and toxoplasmosis. So here's toxoplasmosis. Intestinal protozoan is the disease caused by this intestinal protozoa is called giardiasis. So giardiasis is caused by Giardia lamblia. It can also be caused by Entamoeba histolytica, and then these two guys. You find giardiasis worldwide, and here's the clinical symptoms. Trichomoniasis, we just talked about that. Toxoplasmosis, the protozoan that causes that disease is Toxoplasma gondii. Find that worldwide. Blindness and mental retardation can result in congenitally infected children. So if they get that infection in utero. Here's a probably, I'm guessing, a scanning electron micrograph of Giardia lamblia that causes Giardia. So it's got flagella, you can see the flagella, and it causes diarrhea. If you guys hike, you probably know that you're not supposed to drink from the stream because you could get this protozoan in your gut, and I guess it's pretty ferocious diarrhea. I've never had it. But here's the life cycle of Giardia lamblia. If they find themselves in an adverse environment, they can form a cyst, and then when the environment is not adverse anymore, so it gets moist and nutrients come back, you can release the active form, the trophozoite, and then the result is diarrhea. This is interesting. This Trichonympha acuta, it's a protozoa. It helps digest the wood in the guts of termites. So it's not really the termites that are eating your wood. Well, but that aren't eating, or the termites aren't digesting the wood. So the termites have inside their gut Trichonympha acuta, and it digests the wood from your house. And another well-known protozoa, we talked about this, Trichomonas. So the protozoa is Trichomonas vaginalis. You find that in vaginal infections, and this is what it looks like. Kind of looks like a fish. And it says here Trichomonas vaginalis lives normally in the vagina, but if the pH changes, it will proliferate, and that's when it becomes the disease. Another type of protozoa is Naegleria or Naegleria, and it causes the disease, well, sort of referred to, I don't think this is the exact name, but it's the brain-eating amoeba. But it's a protozoa, and the portal of entry is up your nose. So check this out, this sign, geothermal pool, keep your head above water, or this disease-causing protozoan will get into your nose, and then if you've had 202, you know that the olfactory mucosa lives in your nasal cavity, and if you get into the olfactory neuron, you've got a pathway to the brain. And this is the life cycle. So you've got a cyst here. Looks like it's living in the water. Here's so comes out of the cyst, it's a trophozoite, then it gets a flagella, and then here you are in this geothermal pool, and you put your head in the water. The amoeba goes up into your nasal mucosa to your olfactory neurons and gets to your brain. And then that's not good. African sleeping sickness, we talked about this, is caused by the protozoa called Trypanosoma cruzi. And this is a red blood cell, so these guys are all red blood cells. You probably recognize that. And then here, this gray thing, that is the protozoa Trypanosoma cruzi that causes sleeping sickness. And then there's also another protozoa, Leishmania, that causes leishmaniasis. And this is somebody's skin. I'm not sure, it kind of looks like a forearm, but this is when that protozoa gets into your skin, that's what it looks like. Both of these protozoans, Trypanosoma cruzi and Leishmania, are carried by flies. So the flies are vectors, and they bite you, and it deposits the protozoan into your body. Okay, so we've seen this before in previous videos. This is a diagram of where eukaryotes can get their carbon from and where they can get their energy from. Protozoa mostly are chemoheterotrophic, so they're over here. Chemoheterotrophs, and here they are, protozoa. So they use organic compounds for food. That's the hetero stuff, part of the word. And then they use a carbon source for their chemical compound. So that's chemo. Protozoa can phagocytose bacteria or decaying organic matter, and they're not photosynthetic. Eukaryotes, these are helminths, and they're worms. So check this out. Here's a worm, a helminth that was slit. Oh, or I'm sorry. I know it's gross. This is an intestine, and it's sliced open, and you can see these worms inside the intestines. And then check out, here's the worm's face, here's the helminth's face, there's little, looks like his little eyes here, and then there's its teeth. So here's a flow chart of parasites. So parasites can be protozoa, which we've been talking about. They can be arthropods, like mosquitoes, or they can be worms, like helminths. And then the protozoa can be intestinal protozoa, urogenital, blood and tissue. Helminths, they can be these guys, cestodes, trematodes, or nematodes. But in general, helminths, as we've been talking about, are eukaryotes. They have really complex life cycles, which you don't have to know for the test. And they also have multiple organ systems. So some of the organ systems could include the gastrointestinal tract, for example. If you are a helminth and you are a trematode, your morphology or your shape is flat and you don't have segments. If you are a cestode, you are a helminth and your morphology is also flat, but you are segmented. You are a segmented worm. So if you're a trematode, you're an unsegmented worm. If you're a cestode, you are a segmented worm, aka helminth. If you are a nematode worm, you or helminth, you are not a flatworm. You are a roundworm. Go helminths. And here's some life cycles. You don't have to know the details from Enterobius vermicularis and Taenia solium are both helminths. And here's their life cycle. So they lay their eggs on the perianal folds of your anus. Then you can fecal oral route of transmission. So if someone touches their perianal folds and puts their fingers on something and you have food on that surface and then you eat that food, then you are ingesting those embryonated eggs. Then you'll get larvae in your intestine, and then the female will migrate to your perianal region and lay more eggs, and then you can infect more people. So that's this helminth. And then this helminth, Taenia solium, kind of has the same idea. Eggs are in feces, and then they're passed to animals, and then those animals can pass the tapeworm to the humans, and then you have a tapeworm. So that's lovely. That's the eukaryotic helminths, aka worms. So now just to finish up, let's look at some arthropod vectors. So remember we said vectors carried protozoa and caused disease. Mechanical vectors will carry the pathogen from place to place. So for example, on their limbs. Biological, if you are a biological vector, you are a host for the pathogen. So it lives inside you, and the inside of your body is hosting the pathogen. If you're a mechanical vector, you're just carrying the pathogen on the outside of your body. So some arthropod vectors include these guys. I'm sure everybody's heard of each one of these. Here's a tick. It's the actual size. This is a mite. Fleas, like on dogs, lice. And this is a true fly. I'm not sure what the difference, if they have false flies, but this is a true fly. Mosquitoes, we all know what those are. And then there's true bugs. So maybe there's false bugs as well. So the mechanical vectors include the arachnids. They have 4 pairs of legs. You probably remember that from grade school. They include ticks and mites. So I think on the East Coast, mites are called chiggers. Ticks are more important arachnid carriers. They're mechanical vectors, so they carry bacteria, viruses, protozoal diseases. Ticks can carry Lyme disease, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and others. So in addition to mechanical vectors, we have biological vectors like mosquito. And their biological vectors can be insects. They have 3 pairs of legs as opposed to the arachnids that have 4. The most important arthropod vectors of disease is a mosquito. You probably knew that. They carry malaria, yellow fever, dengue fever, viral encephalitis. And here's all the ways that these vectors can carry the plague or host the plague. So the fleas that carry the plague are actually, these fleas are being hosted by the rodents, so they're living off the rodents.